Welcome back to Radio Rothbard, the current events podcast of the Ludwig von Mises Institute. You can find all of our archives at the Mises Institute website at mises.org. This week we're going to talk a little bit about the public school system and how it conditions students to be good, compliant little citizens and subjects of the U.S. state. But first, I just wanted to make sure you knew about our giveaway going on at the Mises Institute right now. We are giving away 100,000 copies of Murray Rothbard's What Has Government Done to Our Money? This is a great monograph. It's a mercifully short book that you can read in a couple of afternoons and really just covers everything you need to know, whether you need a refresher or you just need an introduction into the nature of money, the nature of central banking, what happens to money when the government inflates it, and how does that impact you as a normal person, and how does it create business cycles, all of those issues. If you want a short and concise explanation of all of that in one place, be sure and pick up your copy. You can get more than one copy. You can get a copy for yourself. You can get copies to give away at mises.org/money. That's mises.org/money, and you can fill out that little form there. All right. Well, let's talk about the topic of the week, and I wanted to bring on one of our columnists, Karl Streitel. Now, he, several days ago, had a new article with us called Public Schools Have No Respect for the Students or Their Parents. And so I brought Karl on to join me and Tho Bishop, my associate editor, to really tell us a little bit about this article and what the deal is right now and what the problem is. I mean, I guess we'll probably call this podcast The Problem with Public Schools. So, Karl, why don't you really just, let's just kick it over to you, introduce the article and some of the main ideas here, and we can flesh that out a little bit more.
Sure, absolutely. And Ryan and Tho, I just wanted to say thank you so much for having me. Big fan of the podcast, and actually one of my acquaintances was just talking to me yesterday, and I had mentioned that I was probably going to be on, and he said, "Oh, that's my favorite podcast. I never miss an episode." So hopefully I will not harm your subscribership too badly.
He's going to unsubscribe after he hears your episode.
Immediately. So to the article, the article that I wrote, and almost everything I write about public schools stems from my own experience as a former public school teacher. I'm retired now, but I did teach in public schools for 19 years as an English and a finance teacher at the high school level. So as I'm sure all of you know, and the readers out there, I often pepper my articles with little anecdotes from my own experience. And this one was no different, that I'll get to in a second. So basically I broke down, and there were so many, unfortunately, from which to choose. But the three items that I thought were very important and holistic representations, basically, of the problems with the public schools and the way that they disrespect the students, the parents, and really everyone who's involved, even on an ancillary basis like taxpayers. And those three that I mentioned were control of time, aggression in one form or another, and lies. And so those were kind of the three broad categories of the disrespect and the ways that I saw that playing out in the government school system.
Well, I mean, let's just go to the article, I suppose, and look at some of the points you make. And of course, anybody can read this on Mises.org. And I mean, let's just take one of the topics that you look at, which is really this idea of getting people regimented and really trying to create people to behave in a certain way. I mean, what is that? What is there something specific the schools are trying to get out of their students in terms of not the academic content, to which I think it makes up a less and less important part of schooling all the time, and I'm not sure it was ever really the most important part. But what's this behavioral conditioning part of public schooling that seems to be, and anyone who's been through it like me knows what I'm talking about. the scheduling, the idea of this is how you behave under certain circumstances. Really, what's going on there, and are public schools deliberately trying to accomplish something specific?
Yeah, I to the last point first. Are they trying to accomplish something specific? I do think that is something that undergirds the entire system. Now, again, having worked in there myself, it wasn't something that we talked about in faculty meetings. We didn't frequently get together and say, all right, so how are we going to like hammer home obedience this upcoming week? But obviously, it's just part and parcel of the system itself at this point, and that's one of the reasons that I've argued at various points and with various people that I don't hold out a lot of hope for the system to be able to reform itself, and that's why I love the idea of the alternatives to the public school system. So, just wanted to touch on that point quickly, but to the idea of what's actually being taught and this conditioning, as you put it, Ryan, that's going on. Obedience is definitely that big aspect. I'm reading a book by Clark Aldrich right now about unschooling, and he goes through these various lessons, which is a fantastic book, and the actual name escapes me, but it's something like Unschooling Lessons or something like that, Clark Aldrich. And he mentions one of the lessons is what you learn in school primarily is how to learn in school, as he puts it. So this idea that we're conditioning you for how to basically behave well in this particular, and I consider it to be a very artificial environment. I mean, when we learn outside of a government school building, and I'm just going to, for the sake of brevity, just refer to it as school. When we learn outside of school in our own lives, whether we're 5 years old or 95 years old, rarely do we decide that the most efficient way to learn something is to take a class on it and have that teacher force it on us for 180 days of a school year. I mean, I've never learned that way outside of school in my life. And that's certainly not, in my opinion, the most efficient way to learn things. So I think that lesson of sit down, be quiet, listen to what we have to tell you, obey authority is definitely one of the main elements of this particular school system. And I mean, I also think that the idea of not just behaving, but uncritically accepting this system that's given to you by the quote unquote experts. I mean, we don't have to get off on a tangent here about, the problems with experts necessarily, and or at least unquestioning authority to experts over the last 4 years. I think we're all aware of that. But I do think that a lot of that stems from the school system where, I mean, look at what happens. Just in order to be a teacher, you have to present yourself as an expert. You have to have a degree, you have to have certification, et cetera, et cetera. You have to constantly take continuing education, which I can tell you from the inside is completely useless. Right? It does absolutely nothing. Just like my degree was basically pretty much useless as well. So both of my degrees were pretty much useless. So I don't think that makes a teacher. But in the eyes of the people who are involved in the system, parents, students who have sort of been dragooned into accepting this against their will, or at least paying for it, that veneer of that facade of expertise, I think, is also something that is taught in the schools, in the sense of obedience to, obsequiousness to the expertise of the teacher, that we can do something that you at home can't. And I believe it was in this article as well that I mentioned, I had conversations with many parents who were thinking about perhaps homeschooling their children, but were concerned that they didn't have the expertise to do it. That was, I heard that multiple times, that, well, we don't really know how, I don't know anything about chemistry. So how can I possibly homeschool my student who, wants to learn chemistry, et cetera, et cetera. So I think those are some of the big lessons to answer your question. And I apologize, sort of a roundabout way.
Well, of course, a lot of this is baked into the history of the modern education system. There are few works that really transform a profession, but John Dewey's My Pedagogic Creed would certainly be among those that can be counted with those ranks, as well as Elward Cumberly, who were two major intellectuals molding the modern education system that we have, and their explicit goal, I mean, their aim was to really install this factory style model. They saw children and students as kind of raw materials to be turned, to be transformed into useful widgets of society by the way that they saw it. And so again, these are not accidental consequences that just emerged over time. I mean, this was the deliberate aim of having a greater role of the state within the system. And of course, you get all sorts of your expected historical anecdotes, like Dewey praising the communist education system and the Soviet Union and the like. All your expected sort of check boxes that you would expect from early 20th century progressives, you get baked within this cake. Again, the results are these are not an accidental consequence of state involvement, but again, one of the explicit goals of having the state really take over the form of education in this country.
Well, I think is very often forgotten today because there's so much lofty talk about education and how it prepares the student to be a citizen and all of this sort of thing. And I suppose it does prepare you to be a citizen. Don't ask questions, take orders from experts, that sort of thing. I think that's the modern ideal of citizenship. But historically, there was at least as much a function in terms of there was this alliance between school and well, how would we describe them? Between the employers, right? And this has always been true historically, right? I mean, schools, even in the Middle Ages, provided a function of, hey, we need more clergy, or we need more lawyers, we need more doctors, and that's what a lot of the early schools and universities were founded for, not necessarily or primarily for helping people ask deep philosophical questions. I mean, that came with the territory eventually. But you can see that in some of the early analysis of what did people need to learn in early industrialization periods. And this is discussed a lot in the literature, if you look at economic history literature, in terms of getting workers used to the idea of a regimented daily schedule. And people perhaps lose sight of the fact that in an agricultural society, people are not used to showing up places at a particular time on the clock. They're more governed by they show up to things based on how much sunlight there is or what the weather is. And that, of course, changes throughout the year as well as to how much you work and when. And like throughout Europe, where there was more Catholicism, you had this thing called Saint Mondays, where, there's a feast day, and so we're not showing up today, or we're showing up late, or maybe we partied a little too much on Sunday, so we're coming in at noon on Monday. And this, of course, drove a lot of the factory owners crazy during much of that period, but that was what was available in the workforce, and there wasn't much you could do about it. But one of the benefits was then having the schools help with getting people used to a certain time, a certain kind of work. And one example I think can be found in an article called, it's by historian Barbara Tucker. And it's Samuel Slater and the Origins of the American Textile Industry. It looks at a New England textile factory and what challenges did they face. And in one of her paragraphs, she notes that, quote, industrial discipline posed some of the gravest problems faced by early factory masters who had to devise various methods to teach people the so-called habits of industry: regularity, obedience, sobriety, steady intensity, and punctuality. Most manufacturers solve such problems in one of two ways: the stick and carrot approach, that is, right, negotiating your contract. But there were other methods too. These are discussed by the historian E.P. Thompson. And what Thompson talks about, as Tucker notes here, is that he thought, well, basically we can condition people through education to show up so that internally they're holding themselves to these standards rather than demanding more pay to behave in a certain way, which is perfectly legit for workers to do. We can convince them that they should behave a certain way, and then they don't even think in terms of, well, we should be asking for more money for this. And so that seems to be a very important function that the schools play. And it just made me think of that when I read your statement here, where you say, perhaps the most obvious yet overlooked way that I and others in the school system disrespected students was by controlling their time. The bell system, a relic of concern over the efficient use of buildings and punctuality ensures that students know when it is time to learn a subject and when it is time to stop learning a subject. And that's very much it, right? Where people now associate schooling with learning and learning with schooling. And you show up and you go places at certain times based on a bell, which throughout most of human history was seen to human beings as just downright bizarre. There were church bells that indicated maybe there was the Angelus bell at 6 a.m. and 6 p.m., which if you wanted to, you could pray at that time. But that's a far cry from you stand up and you go to a different room now, and you completely change whatever it is you're working on. And so I think it's that behavioral modification that's just such an important part of it, even though, as you note, it's basically ignored. We mostly talk in terms of what are people learning? And by that, they mean what's in the books. And that's just probably secondary in terms of what's actually going on in these institutions.
Yeah, and it's interesting to know too from my research that when they call it the Gary Bell system, since supposedly it originated in Gary, Indiana, when that system was brought to New York City, there were actually riots in the streets that parents were out, pitchforks and whatever we can imagine, saying like how inhuman this type of system was. So originally. And again, I think at its core or at our cores, we understand that this is not a natural way of organizing learning because, as I mentioned previously, none of us does that in our own lives. So why we would think that that's the best way to do things for 12 years or I guess college too, to a certain extent, 16 years. Why we would think that's the best way to organize things for our children is beyond me. And the fact that in years past, parents recognized that and fought as valiantly as I suppose they could against it. And we see, unfortunately, what that got them. I think speaks volumes that this was not something that the people wanted. This is not something that parents brought in on their own. To Tho's point as well, I'll also bring up, besides everybody's favorite John Dewey, Horace Mann, of course, the gentleman in Massachusetts who originally even traveled over to Prussia when it was Prussia to bring back the Prussian education system. And, Massachusetts, where he lived, had the first compulsory school system in the United States. And now, of course, as is often the case, Horace Mann's own children went to, private schools, not public schools. So they were exempted from that. But nonetheless, this idea that he wanted to ensure that people were, because again, it was based on that idea of a distrust of the family, that we can't possibly trust every family. Now, certainly you, to whom I'm talking right now, you good citizen, we're not talking about you. You're certainly trustworthy, but you know who we're talking to, some of those other people over there. And of course, over time, that took the form of Catholics in particular coming over from Europe. And, the Protestants who were already well established here, they made no bones about it that part of the reason that we want to ensure compulsory education is to basically disabuse these rubes of their dangerous Catholic notions, and so that they can accept Protestantism into their lives. And so we're going to do that through the government school system. And again, this is just a historical fact. This isn't a conspiracy theory or anything like that. And even though people might say, of course, and rightly so today, that's certainly not the case. It's not like we're teaching Protestantism in the schools. But as you pointed out, Ryan, now it's changed to arguably something, depending on how you feel about Protestantism, more insidious or, more propagandistic, because it's something that's universal. It's not like people are going home and saying, oh, well, we're going to practice Catholicism here. But, what they tell you about Protestantism in the school, we'll just kind of forget about it. But that idea of obedience runs throughout society, the idea of accepting democracy for what it is, for example. I write about that quite a bit as well. And, the notion that, that's one of the biggest things. We hear that, again, hey, we're preparing students for careers in college. That was always the big thing, college and careers, in that order. And I thought, and then we have to bandy about terms like critical thinking. Yet, to my mind, critical thinking means asking questions, and especially asking questions of things that are your most cherished beliefs, your most foundational beliefs. If you're not asking questions of those, how can we say that you're possibly thinking critically about anything? Yet, walk into a public school and ask any student walking through the hall. I mean, if you can even get in, with the metal detectors and everything like that. Ask any student walking through the hall, when was the last time you had a debate about whether democracy is a good system or not, right? And whether the teacher weighed in at the end to make sure that we all came to a consensus that, well, yes, it is. Or how many times do we have to vote on things in school? And I look at even things that seem to be very, very just unimpactful in some way, like class officers and things like that. We have the senior class officers, the junior class officers, but it's setting kids up for the idea that, yes, there are going to be these people whom we're going to elect, and they're going to speak for us. And even if we don't really like what they say, well, hey, there are officers. So again, it's these little things that go in there that seem very, I would say, even, happy and acceptable. And hey, like, how can you have who is this guy? He has a problem with class officers in school. Like, what kind of misanthrope is he? They say, yeah, but again, let's look at the ideas that go along with that people are taking without thinking critically about them.
Well, of course, I mean, I don't know how it is in school nowadays, but of course, we didn't always fall for it, right? We generally regarded the class officers as narcs and teachers' pets and frauds, usually. Like, they were usually not nearly as good as they had given the impression to their elders, that they were sweet kids who tried hard. They were probably the most successful cheaters and and fakers was how we viewed these people. But it always seemed that the older people, the experts, were the most gullible in terms of being tricked by the sneakiness of the kids. And so, of course, that made us disrespect the faculty all the more, and some of us then, of course, came away feeling that the experts were actually dumber than the general population and more savvy. But it could have been we were the ones being played, that maybe the teachers knew all along what the reality was, and they were just putting a certain chosen group of elites into positions of power to keep the rest of us students in line. I have no idea. But I mean, that just shows how despicable what's going on in these situations is that there's all these weird social dynamics and attempts to condition people to accept quote unquote elites, even among the students, who, of course, have no particular expertise or anything like that. They're just maybe the kids who are best at smiling, maybe the best looking kids, the most favored kids. Nowadays, it's probably the non-white kids. And I mean, that's just kind of how it works. And I think the kids do pick up on that often, but probably not a majority. I mean, when you look at how people come out of school and how they're just so utterly unprepared to function in any sort of situation where there's an actual diversity of people with different ages and different backgrounds and different opinions. People seem really unequipped to deal with that sort of thing.
Well, and thankfully, there's no scenario where a student that does speak up to the teacher has it resulting in lower grades for his work than otherwise would be. Luckily, that never takes place within the education system that is so privileged.
Yeah.
Right, because the teachers themselves, they love dissenting voices and views and are very, very good at dealing with people who disagree with them. I mean, this is one of the great things about social media, right, is all of these videos of teachers absolutely freaking out. Well, let's look at that, actually. And this keeps coming back to your issue of teaching people expertise and people feeling that they can't homeschool because they don't have the expertise of these students. And I think that suffered a pretty bad blow during COVID. This idea that there's something going on in these schools where the people who teach, they have special knowledge that we as the parents don't have. And of course, we hand our children over to these people many hours per day because we're not equipped. We don't have that depth of knowledge. And then what happened during COVID is, of course, these students then were learning online, and the parents started to see what was going on in these classrooms and what was being taught. And I fault the parents for this, right? That they were too lazy or too disinterested to really examine what their children were reading and what was being taught, and themselves asking questions about what was going on in the classroom. So apparently there's no shortage of gullible parents Those are probably those people who, I guess, were the hall monitors, were the class officers themselves in school, were the people who were good and obedient. And so then they grew up to be people who trusted the public schools. And then they didn't, no questions asked. I'll just hand my kids over to these people. But some of them were forced to then see what was going on and just how nothing was being taught of any particular value. And then a lot of it was just really reprehensible stuff. People started to notice a lot of this, like these weird, like graphic novels with essentially porn in them, and they were like, what is going on in these schools? And people started to really ask questions that I don't think they were bothering to ask before COVID, which is really shameful. I don't think we should let the parents off the hook for this. But I think now when you saw these rather significant increases in homeschooling, and the fact that people also noticed that, of course, a lot of these public school teachers, they did not want to go back to work after COVID, right? Even after everybody else was back in the office or working full time, the teachers were protesting and complaining and whining that they might have to go back to work and basically show up for something. And the unions were saying, oh, you can't make us work. And people were realizing, oh, so it turns out they have no interest actually educating our children. Also, my kids haven't been to school now in 18 months, and they probably would have been better off just if I'd been teaching them for 3 hours a day here at home. So I think it really kind of took that veneer off of expertise and this idea that there was something special happening in public schools that nobody else could recreate. And that mystique is still there for many people, but I think for a lot of people it's now gone.
Yeah, and I think, to be clear, I agree with your point about parental responsibility. Obviously, I mean, I hope most people would agree with that point. And I do think that a lot of parents do abrogate that responsibility and then allow the public schools to just basically take that over. And to be clear, I don't think that there's anything wrong necessarily with having somebody else educate your children, just like there's nothing wrong with having somebody else build a house for you. But man, I hope you're paying attention. Like when that person, if your family's going to live in that house, I bet you're going to pay attention to make sure that it's actually built well. Yet, to your point, I don't think a lot of people were speaking of critical thinking, we're looking very critically at government schools prior to COVID, as you pointed out, Ryan. And yeah, I do think that's, to all of our detriment. So yeah, if there was one positive thing about the lockdowns, I mean, then that was definitely one of them, that people started to ask those questions. And I think the numbers show us too. I was just reading about this the other day as well, that awareness and or that desire for an alternative to schools that are obviously failing in a variety of ways seems to be most heightened in many areas in the inner cities and in minority neighborhoods among, for example, African Americans and Hispanics. It seems to be, they're the two of the largest groups, I believe, in terms of embracing homeschooling and micro schooling outside of the government schools, which again, if I see one person, leaving, and I should say, because a lot of times people ask, oh, you just hate government schools so much. And I don't necessarily, disagree with that on the surface, but I would point out that what I really want is just for people to choose actively among the options that are available to them. Now, I don't want government schools, of course, to be taxpayer funded, but if you like your school that's down the street and you want to pay full freight for that for your kids, or have donations to pay for that, hey, that's fine with me. Like, I don't want to shut down your school. I just don't want to pay for it. And I want you to be choosing that school actively, knowing what's going on in there, not passively because it's convenient. Like one of my neighbors, when I was talking to him about, why his kids ride the bus when we literally live half a mile away from the elementary school that his kids are going to. And he told me, because it's convenient. It's convenient for me. I have 3 kids. So, it's easier for them to take the bus. And, I wondered, all right, well, if you had to pay $1,500 extra per year for that, you got an itemized bill for it, is that worth it for the half mile? And maybe not. But the point is, again, like that decision is being made for everybody else. And we, as you pointed out, have uncritically accepted that as well as so many of the other lessons in government schools for, in my opinion, far too long.
That's a great analogy, by the way, the whole home building thing, right? If you were like remodeling your kitchen, you're going to go in there every day after the workers leave and look around and see how it's coming and make sure it seems, even if you're not an experienced builder, you're going to look and see if it looks like things are put together all right. Whereas it's astonishing how many parents never really actually look under the hood, so to speak, of their children's education. And yeah, and I should know too, I also am not opposed to having other people educate your children. Right, homeschooling's great. It's not for everybody. But yeah, you should be an informed consumer about what sort of schooling is taking place for your children. And I think just there's been, until recently, very little of that going on. But a lot of it has been secret. Right, like we've seen also from leaked tapes, leaked phone conversations from school board members, from school administrators, that they actively don't want the parents to know what's going on in the school. Or we've seen these lawsuits where they decided that a boy was a girl at school, and we're talking like a 7-year-old, right? And then they counseled the 7-year-old on how to keep their quote unquote new gender secret from their parents. For months or years at a time. And that's just bizarre behavior. And I think that's just the sort of thing we would expect from a state institution, though, where part of the ability to get away with what you want as a school or as a government organization, this is true everywhere. It's true in intelligence and military, in all sorts of government spending. You keep it a secret. You just don't tell the public what you're doing. And certainly public schools seem to be doing that as well.
Yeah, obfuscation is the name of the game, right? That that's another. Maybe they're not teaching that to the kids necessarily, but certainly it is something that is part and parcel of the system itself. And I would just point out, in the work that I do now with alternative school options, I love learning about so many of these because one thing that you will see immediately that is different in at least every single, without fail, alternative education option that I've looked at so far. When you go to their website, the very first thing you see is what they teach and what they stand for. And they put that right front and center. So you, as you point out, Ryan, you can be an informed consumer because they know, like, we have to compete for your business. So we want to make sure that we are the right fit for you. We don't just want every single person in the town because guess what? Not everybody learns the same way. Not everybody has the same preferences. Not everybody wants the same curriculum. I mean, we see that every single day now, right? With yard signs all over the place. I mean, I have, the dueling yard signs in my own neighborhood with stop the woke agenda and love is love and all this other stuff that, then the battlefield is the school, right? That's what the problem is, that because it's being forced on people, I think that's the main issue that so many have. And that is something that I think is really solved by the choice in education. That again, these, to your point, Ryan, these alternative options that I've researched, they don't do that. They don't hide. They want you to know. That is the very first thing they want to tell you, that here is what we are all about. Here's what we teach here. Here's how we do it. Oh, and by the way, click this button and make an appointment to take a tour. Like, we want you in the school. I mean, and I actually just read about an option the other day where if you enroll your kids at this school, they ask you to show up as a parent, X number of times per week or X number of times per month, where, even if you can only make like an hour, to show up there and to be a part of that education so that school and home are not constantly asunder, that there isn't this chasm between the two, but that, again, this idea of like lifelong learning, that learning happens every single minute of every single day, and it's not relegated to 7 hours inside this artificial building.
And of course, one of the interesting, this is kind of one of the more controversial topics in the broader conversation about public education, is that one of the political responses that we've seen, I think particularly enlightened by COVID and the experience of parents, has been the increase of vouchers within the education system, which has done a very interesting job of creating more choice but also creates concerns about the extent to which government funding within, for if you take a private school that is now receiving government funding, the extent to which government regulations and rules end up co-opting previously private institutions in that regard. I know there's been different attempts, kind of at a state-by-state basis, to create certain limits to try to defend the independence that allows for that. But I think that's a good measure on the health of any of these, quote unquote school choice programs, to the extent to which having the curriculum at the first and foremost, having that transparency, having that desire for parental involvement, having the restrictions in the process by which students can go to these schools. That is kind of, I think, one of the indicators on how good or bad a charter system is, even though you're still dealing with that murkiness of, obviously, state compulsion, the financing side of things. There is a level ultimately of state involvement, but I think that's one of the areas where it's interesting that you're seeing a lot of middle of the road attempts that can vary a great deal based off a state by state perspective. That has obviously, again, been a backlash to this broader acknowledge that the status quo is not serving communities in the past, and it's kind of adds an additional layer of murkiness to this conversation, but is again, I think, reflecting a healthier trend of growing distrust with these public school institutions.
Yeah, I'm so split about vouchers. I go back and forth about them every single day, and I know that on the Mises Institute, we've had plenty of articles about that, and obviously we can go back to Milton Friedman, one of the original advocates of school vouchers. And my concern ultimately is, and I hope I'm not giving anybody in the government any ideas now, but my concern ultimately is that the voucher program is sort of like the undersea cable by which government control can come in at any time. And, it kind of like sneaks it along this wire of vouchers. And then they can decide how tightly, we want to start controlling you at any moment. So right now, it seems like, many states out there do have a lot of educational freedom and seem to be opening more and more of those doors with voucher type programs. I guess, again, my point is simply that I hope that doesn't then lead to, hey, we've taken all this government money and now we've come to rely on it, which is, the typical, government type of program. And now, a different party gets into power, or even just a different person gets into power in a particular area. And now it's time to start regulating that. Oh, and by the way, if you've ever taken government money, then you're going to be subject to these regulations, or something like that. And that's my concern. However, in the meantime, I will say I completely agree that of the not so awesome options available to us right now, I would much rather see something like vouchers, of course, than everyone continuing to have to pay for a system even if you don't use it. Now, ultimately, it'd be great if we could just do away with school taxes altogether, right? And then people pay for what they want to pay for and no involvement. But obviously that's not going to happen in the next 27 months.
And of course, a big aspect to this is the need for that continual parental interaction within the school system, because it is easy to say, okay, well, now we've got school choice in a district, or even, okay, I'm going to take my student out and I'm going to put them in a private school, right? Even having that as a secondary option. But if you're not really looking at what is being taught there, simply the fact that you've now moved the structure, you've changed the actual brick and mortar, right? You're now opting for a different environment. If what is being taught is a little different, right? If you're still using the same textbook that the public school down the road versus the charter school, the private school, then you might get a better quality teacher. There might be some additional advantages there. You might have there might be a change in the way that your student might be within an environment with people that learn similarly to the way they do. But if they're still getting myths about how all the presidents have been great and we need the Fed and that sort of stuff. Of course, since last week we had the anniversary, we were celebrating the 75th anniversary of Human Action. One of my favorite chapters of that book is the part 7, at the end of Human Action, where Mises goes into great detail about the importance of economics as for the masses. That this is not simply a topic that needs to be confined within the ivory towers of academia, but an essential function of being a citizen in the proper way, not the factory model sort of way. And so one can consider that the best litmus test for the quality of your school system, regardless of the form it takes, is looking at the way that they teach economics, because of the essential nature by which economics creates that framework for skepticism of everything else that the government, every other aspect of government propaganda ultimately is checked, whether it's unconsciously or consciously, by the way that you view basic economic questions. And so if your school is not using Bob Murphy's economics lessons for the young economist, you might be again, even if you have a different alternative to the failing model of the past, again, a lot of the assumptions ultimately when it comes to the relationship of the individual with the state, or the way that history is taught, it's more than simply having choice on the table, but making sure that the choices that you have access to actually subscribe to the values that you have and are actually preparing your child as an individual unit. And that's where, again, the necessity might be more communal, taking advantage of homeschooling groups, of more communal aspects, rather than even other institutions that have either a private nominally or a charter dynamic. Again, it all comes down to what is actually being taught within these classrooms.
Well, and there's so much of a issue here, too, in terms of uniformity and choice, right? We use the phrase school choice usually to refer to something specific, some specific policy, whether it be vouchers or maybe charter schools or something like that. But, of course, it can just mean there are various types of schools available, just like Carl was talking about, right? Different models, different schools, different people. There should be, of course, different levels of licensing, different places you can get licensing, not all controlled by the same people as they essentially are now. Because, of course, what do states want? States want uniformity. They want centralization and instruction, which, of course, is what's been happening. That's the purpose of the Department of Education, is to really make instruction and funding much more uniform so that there's just very little diversity in education, that it reflects what the federal goals are. And Rothbard talks a little bit about this in his monograph, Education Free and Compulsory. This is from 1971. And he talks about really what is the state's ideal for education. Now, in an ideal situation, the state would want something where you don't even raise your children, right? Not only do you hand your children over to the state for education, but you basically hand your children over maybe for state boarding schools, so that they're raised 24/7 by the regime and its agents. And this, of course, the American regime has done this, right, with Native Americans, where, they're speaking the wrong language and they don't appreciate our culture, so we'll put them all in these boarding schools that will teach them the proper culture. But it never really caught on, of course, society-wise. And not even, and Rothbard points out, not even in communist Russia, right, did they attempt the true communism of children, where your child is born. This is like, Plato's Republic, right? The child is born. We take the child away. Maybe they don't even know who their parents are, and they're all raised communally by the regime. That's the state so far has never managed to fully overcome that. But I think what the state has managed to live with is, well, as long as we can have your kids like 50 hours a week, then we can live with that, because we know that'll be enough to cancel out whatever influence you as a parent might have. In most cases. And of course, then if it's all taught by uniform schools of some sort, then you can accomplish the state's goal. And Rothbard notes that, right, this idea of total communism in education, that is total uniformication, if you will, has been very popular in America as well. He notes that America, he says here, quote, America, for example, began for the most part with a system of either completely private or with philanthropic schools. Then in the 19th century, the concept of public education changed subtly, until everybody was urged to go to the public school. And private schools were accused of being divisive. Finally, the state imposed compulsory education on the people, either forcing children to go to public schools or else setting up arbitrary standards for private schools. Parental instruction was frowned on. Thus, the state has been warring with parents for control over their children. And it's notable that historically many states attempted to do this. Even the fervor for public education became so absolute that there's a famous Supreme Court case where the state of Oregon outlawed Catholic schools because they were divisive, because they didn't teach people proper loyalty to society and the regime. And the Supreme Court, in one of, I mean, it was a good, I don't believe the Supreme Court should dictate to states what their education policies should be. But I mean, it was, certainly the philosophy behind the decision was good, which was that parents should be free to contract with whomever they want for the education of the children. And that Oregon's law was horrible. And so they weren't able to carry that out. Apparently, Oregonians have been filled with terrible, terrible collectivist ideas for a long time.
And that was actually in conjunction with the KKK, wasn't it? I believe, if I remember correctly.
Oh, it may very well have been. Yeah, it wasn't a coincidence that it was Catholic schools who were targeted, of course.
Right.
And so, I mean, it's just really remarkable that Rothbard points this out, right? Is we hear this all the time now that, oh, if you go off and you do your own thing with your own schooling, that's divisive. And they usually say it's like a right-wing plot, right? Homeschooling, this is a right-wing plot, which I can tell you in Colorado, it's not a right-wing plot at all. Homeschool families are filled with blue-haired, atheist eccentrics. There's no shortage of such people who hate the public schools because they think children are taught in public school or in public schools to follow some sort of neoliberal model. So for totally different reasons, they keep their kids out of public school, and they should be free to do that. Just like conservatives or Christians or whoever should be free to take their kids out of these schools because they think that their children are taught some sort of horrible ideology that way. But the problem is, of course, the homeschoolers, no matter what their ideological bent is, are forced to pay for public schooling no matter what, whether they get any benefit from them. And that's just really quite amazing, though. Once you can start collecting money from everybody, well, you're essentially establishing a monopoly. And then you're establishing what the Prussians always wanted, right? I mean, it's good that you mentioned the Prussians. America is just filled with terrible ideas that the Americans in the 19th century got from the Prussians. It's not just education. Civil service laws and a lot of that come from Prussia, too, where the whole idea was to teach good obedience to the Prussian regime, militaristic, uniform, despotic. That was always the model for American educators and reformers throughout much of the 19th century, and we're still living with that. And so this idea of disparaging people who want actual school choice as being divisive, because if people go their own way ideologically, well, then that's a danger to democracy. That's a danger to a functioning society. That's really messed up. But a lot of people definitely think that way, and they learn to think that way in school, and for the most part.
Yeah, and to your point about people choosing to homeschool or just leave the public school system for a variety of reasons. Yeah, that it's so true. And like so many other issues, as soon as the government gets involved and starts forcing people to do things, it creates these artificial divisions. It creates this artificial acrimony among people. And like personally, I don't have any problem with what my neighbor wants to teach his or her children. Obviously, unless it aggresses against me, but otherwise, hey, as long as you're not stealing money from me to pay for it, I don't really care, right? What you're teaching, your children, or what school you choose to send them to. But, to circle back to the point that I made earlier, that I think, so many of these battles that we see waged in local school districts these days are a result of almost entirely that people are being forced to pay for it, and they feel like it's being forced onto their kids because of the compulsory aspect of government school. And if we removed those two elements, the compulsory payments and the compulsory attendance, then I think we'd have far fewer battles among neighbors who ordinarily would have no problem with each other. But again, the government creates these artificial battles among all of us, right? So that we're not, fighting against the government, of course, and looking at that as the problem. And I will just say, because I interviewed a woman last week, and she, if she hears this, she'll be very upset if I don't defend Oregon and say that in Oregon, I will say, and I didn't believe this until she told me. But first of all, I'll give her a little plug. Her name is Brittany Shannon, and she runs a website called optionsforeducation.com. And she lives in Southern Oregon. And there is a vibrant, gigantic movement of people who are trying to leave and have left and have started alternatives to the government school system in that area in particular. I was shocked, and for a wide variety of reasons. But she also told me a story that I think is very pertinent to what we're talking about, which is, she had a son who was diagnosed as ADHD, and had learning difficulties, and always struggled in government school, which is almost always the case for anybody who doesn't fit into that mold and or who can't be basically like beaten to that mold. Anybody who's a free thinker in any way. And as she later on, after he had already gotten out of the school system, but she was learning about some of these options and found out about this school. It's called the Earthwise Forest School. And the kids are playing outside all day, and they integrate the normal subjects into outdoor play. And so, for people for whom that might be a good option, hey, that's fantastic. And she saw this school and thought, oh my gosh, like if my son had known about this, if we had known about this, and I could have gotten him into this school, if it had existed when he was in school, he would have thrived. Like, I have no doubt. And it was a very emotional story for her. And I thought, that is exactly, those are the types of stories that I think people need to hear to truly understand, like, why I think it is just absolutely terrible and immoral to not give people that choice and to let them pick out the best educational options for their kids in the same way that they pick out the best foods, right, that they think are going to be the best for their families, right? That thankfully we have no restrictions on that so far, but you know best what your kids like to eat in the same way that you and your kids know best how they like to learn. So to me, that's sort of the overall lesson.
Well, I think that leads me to my last question for you then, because we often get from readers and donors is all right, well, what do you suggest as solutions to our current problem? And one of the positions I've long taken is if you want to weaken the state, you have to offer institutions. It's not enough to just be an individual. You need to build institutions that compete with the state and make the state something other than your only choice, right? You need strong families, strong parishes, strong churches, strong even really local governments that don't depend on, federal funding, federal taxes, centralized everything. And so and you just touched on this a little bit in the answer you just gave, but how would you summarize it then? So say I'm a person and I want to build some of these educational institutions that can provide alternatives to the state. I don't want to be homeschooling on my own. I want to be part of some sort of educational institution, and I don't want my kids in public schools. So what really should people be looking for in terms of, okay, this is an institution you can help build that is something other than private schools and helps compete with it?
So in this answer, I think we'll see it's the nice part, but the frustrating part as well, because there isn't a centralized resource, of course, where we can just go and find all these answers. But that's the good thing too, that people are disparate in their ideas, but it also makes it, of course, more difficult to have a succinct answer to that question where I can just say, go to this website and look at this. I mean, I'll plug a couple different things. I'll mention that the website that I said before, optionsforeducation.com, and others like it that provide resources. I think on that website, Brittany has over 300 different alternative learning options of a variety of types and sizes and things like that. I'd also point out, get involved on social media. I've talked to a lot of people who started a Facebook group or found other people on Facebook, for whatever, the evils of social media, there are some good things too, being able to connect people across the country, because in many ways, there might be a like a co-op or a micro school right down the street from you, and you don't even know about it. And in fact, Brittany had mentioned that there were all these people in her area who had started different micro schools and co-ops and other things like that, who didn't even know about each other until they got brought together at some of these seminars that she holds. So I would recommend that. Look for those groups on social media as well. I'll also mention that, doing searches online for things like micro schools will get you a bevy of resources too. I'll put in a selfish plug for my podcast, Learning Liberty, where I interview people from these different learning options. I try to interview parents and the founders so that people can sort of get an inside look at what is going on here. I just spoke to a gentleman the other day. His name is Michael Finnegan, and he runs a website called Quantum Camp, like quantum physics, quantumcamp.com, where they offer science curricula to really anybody. He specializes in homeschool micro schools, but you can go onto his website right now and you can buy an entire year of chemistry and physics, and they're coming out with, I believe, biology and life science in about a year. But you can buy all this and they will ship you, so you get an online platform, and they will ship you all of the lab supplies that you need to do this from in your own home. So even if you are in a government school, but you say, oh my gosh, like I'm not learning anything in chemistry class, like I didn't, then you can do this. And it's almost all lab based. Like you'll go through 60 labs in a year and it's $450, like for all that, which just blows my mind. So it's resources like that I think, again, I wish, I wish I had here's one website to go to, but I'm just trying to sort of scattershot approach here with throwing these out there, because through people like this, if you find one of those resources, it's like anything else on the internet. Go down the rabbit hole and you're going to find a bunch of other resources connected to this. And all of these people I found, they want nothing else than to share their information with other people. Whether it's, in a marketing perspective, sure, but just in being a good human perspective, because they believe in what they're doing. They're happy to talk to me. They're happy to talk to anybody else. So people can email, Michael Finnegan or Bertani Shannon. And I think she even has a phone number on her website. She wants to help people find these options. And if there isn't something on the website, she says, give me a call. I'll see what I can find out in my network for you. So I think it's like so many other things in society, right? That it's the boots on the ground. It's the individual human beings, human action that is, truly responsible for connecting us to these resources and helping us find ways and models that we can use too if we want to start our own. And that would have been a good place to end. But I just wanted to mention two quick others. There are also networks out there of micro schools that have proven models, and hundreds, sometimes even thousands of these schools across the country. The two that I would mention, one is called Prenda, Prenda, and the other one is Acton Academy, Acton, Acton Academy. And both of those I personally think that they're fantastic models. And so people can kind of look those up as well if they want to see some ideas or get more connections. So those are some of the resources that I would have.
All right. Well, we'll go ahead and wrap up with that then. Thank you, Karl Streitel, for joining us today. His article is Public Schools Have No Respect for the Students or Their Parents. Check it out at Mises.org. And then you can check out his article archive as well. And, thank you, Tho, for joining us today also. And, thank you for listening to Radio Rothbard. We'll be back next week with another episode, so we'll see you next time.